Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into something that, well, might be pretty personal for some folks.
Mm.
Trauma.
Oh,
We'll be
yeah.
unpacking this workbook. It's designed to go along with The Body Keeps the Score. But even if you haven't gotten around to reading that yet,
Yeah,
this deep dive, I think will give you a good idea of whether you want to.
absolutely. And what's so interesting is that this workbook kicks off with a pretty simple definition of trauma. An emotional response to a terrible event. But the deeper you go, the more you realize trauma, it's not just bad feelings.
Right. So it's not all in our heads.
Yeah.
There's a real physical side to this whole thing.
There is. It can really impact your brain and your body in ways you might not even realize. It's like your system gets stuck in that emergency mode, even when the danger is long gone.
Like that fight or flight thing everybody's always talking about, it doesn't just switch off like magic after something stressful.
Nope. And that's a big reason why just talking about things, traditional therapy, while it's helpful, it might not be enough for some people to really heal from trauma. It's like if you broke your leg and all you did was talk about it, you got to deal with the physical part too.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I see why this is such a complex topic.
Yeah.
And speaking of complex, this workbook gets into all these different kinds of trauma. It's not just about one big scary event.
Right. You've got your acute trauma. That's maybe what comes to mind first. Feeling anxious on edge for weeks after a car accident or something. But then there's chronic trauma that
Yeah.
comes from dealing with stressful or dangerous situations over and over again. Like if you were bullied for a long time or lived in a place that just didn't feel safe.
And it doesn't even stop there. It goes into complex trauma and
Right.
secondary trauma, things I hadn't really thought much about.
Yeah, complex trauma is especially tough because it's not just one thing, it's multiple traumatic events. And often they happen over a really long period.
Right.
So, imagine dealing with abuse or neglect or witnessing violence over and over. It's like a whole web of interconnected wounds.
So it's not just one trauma plus another. It creates a whole other level of difficulty.
Exactly. Then there's secondary trauma, which is how taking care of a trauma survivor can actually take a toll on you.
Really?
Yeah, it's like you absorb some of their emotional burden and stress, even though you didn't go through the trauma yourself.
Wow. Never thought about it like that.
Yeah,
So therapists, first responders, even family members, they could be going through this too.
absolutely. And here's where it gets even wilder. The workbook suggests that even good experiences, positive things can be traumatic if they completely overwhelm you.
Hold on. So not just car accidents and violence and stuff.
Right. Think of a kid who gets separated from their parents at a theme park. It might seem minor, but it can still trigger a traumatic response if it's too much for them to handle.
Okay, mind officially blown. This is way more nuanced than I expected.
And that's why it's so important to be able to recognize the signs of trauma, which aren't always obvious.
So how do we even know if we're dealing with trauma? Especially if it's not from some big life-changing event.
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something the workbook tackles head on. A lot of people don't realize they're experiencing trauma because it can show up in weird ways like physical symptoms, emotional outbursts, even problems in your relationships.
So it's not always like a big meltdown or flashbacks. It can be in our everyday life without us realizing it's connected to trauma.
Exactly. Think about those times you felt anxious for no reason, or irritable, or you just couldn't sleep. Or maybe you've got those recurring stomach problems or pain that doctors can't figure out.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
But how do we know if those things are actually from trauma?
Well, one of the key ideas in the workbook is somatization. Basically, when your emotional distress turns into physical symptoms.
Okay, I've heard that word, but can you give me an example, like a real-world one?
Sure. Imagine you've got chronic back pain, and the doctors, they can't find anything wrong physically. The workbook suggests this could be your body's way of dealing with emotional pain or trauma that hasn't been resolved.
Wow. It's like your emotions are literally stuck in your body.
Kind of spooky, right?
Yeah. So if talk therapy doesn't always work, and trauma can be hard to spot, what does this workbook recommend? Is there any hope for getting better?
Oh, there absolutely is. And the exciting part is it offers hope beyond just talking. It highlights some new ways to heal that address both your mind and body.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
One of the most promising things is something called neurofeedback. And the workbook explains it in a way that's easy to understand, even if you're not a scientist.
Neurofeedback. Sounds pretty high-tech. What exactly is it?
Think of it as physical therapy, but for your brain. A way to retrain those pathways that are stuck in emergency mode. They use sensors to keep track of your brain waves. And when your brain shows signs of relaxation and calm, it gets rewarded.
Wait, so you're basically giving your brain a gold star for chilling out.
Pretty much. And over time, with enough sessions, your brain starts to learn how to regulate itself, even when things get tough.
So you're not erasing the bad memories,
And
but you're teaching your brain to react differently to them.
exactly. And what's amazing is that research is showing good results with neurofeedback. Even for people who haven't had much luck with traditional therapy, it's like giving your brain the tools it needs to heal itself.
That's incredible. But what about people who don't have access to all that fancy technology? Are there other ways to heal?
For sure. The workbook has a whole section dedicated to practical steps for healing from trauma. And you can start doing these right now, whether you get professional help or not.
Okay, now you're talking. What kind of practical steps?
One of the big ones is accepting and processing your trauma. This isn't about dwelling on the past or wallowing in your pain. It's about acknowledging what happened, understanding how it affected you, and starting to make sense of it all.
Makes sense. But how do you actually do that?
The workbook recommends journaling. It's like having a safe space where you can confront those tough memories without being judged or scared.
I've heard about journaling, but I'll be honest, I've always been a bit skeptical. How can just writing things down really help with trauma?
Think of it as a way to get those thoughts and feelings out of your head. Putting them on paper can help you see things more clearly, notice patterns, and start to detach from their power over you.
Okay, I see how that could be useful. But it can't just be about focusing on the past, right? There's got to be more to healing than that.
You're right, acceptance is just the first step. The workbook also talks about self-responsibility, which isn't about blaming yourself for what happened, but about owning your healing journey.
So it's about taking control and moving forward.
Exactly. Which brings us to another important thing, mindfulness. The workbook highlights staying present and avoiding rumination. You know those endless loops of negative thoughts that keep you stuck in the past?
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
My mind is constantly racing with worries and what-ifs.
I hear you. But the workbook has some simple but effective meditation techniques that can help you be more aware of the present moment. It's about observing your thoughts and feelings without judging them, like watching clouds drift by.
But creating some distance between yourself and those overwhelming thoughts.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the easier it gets to shift your focus from the past to right now, where you can actually choose how you respond.
That's pretty powerful. So acceptance, self-responsibility, mindfulness. What else? I'm starting to feel like maybe I could tackle this.
Oh, and don't forget about moving your body. The workbook really stresses how exercise, even a little bit, can make a huge difference in your mood and how you handle stress. It's like giving your body a chance to release all that pent-up tension.
I know exercise is good for you, but how does it actually help with trauma?
Think about it. When you go through trauma, your body goes into that fight or flight mode. Pumping out adrenaline and cortisol, exercise helps burn those stress hormones off, leaving you feeling calmer, more centered.
So like hitting the reset button on your nervous system?
Exactly. And there's another bonus. Exercise releases endorphins, those feel-good chemicals in your brain. So you're not just getting rid of stress, you're also giving yourself a natural mood lift.
Okay. I'm definitely on board with that. So journaling, meditation, exercise, anything else we can add to our trauma healing toolkit?
One of the most powerful tools, and often the most overlooked, is connection. The workbook really stresses reaching out to people you love, joining a support group, or just spending time with people you trust.
So it's not just about what we do for ourselves. It's about who we have around us, too.
Absolutely. Trauma often leads to feeling isolated and disconnected. So nurturing those social bonds is incredibly healing. It's about creating a sense of safety and belonging, knowing that you're not alone in this.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground. But before we move on, I want to mention something that really struck me in the workbook.
Oh, what was it?
Well, if trauma can actually change our brains and bodies, does that mean it's also possible for positive change and growth to happen after trauma? Can something good come from something so painful?
That's a deep question, and it's definitely something we'll explore more as we dig deeper into the workbook. You know what really got me in this workbook? It's how it breaks down what trauma does to your brain. Like, it's not just this vague feeling of stress or whatever. There are actual changes happening up there. You can measure them.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm intrigued. I remember it talked about different parts of the brain, but I didn't quite get how that all worked.
So picture your brain as this three-part system. Each part's got its own job. You got the forebrain, the limbic system, and the brainstem. Forebrain's like the CEO, handles the big stuff, planning, making decisions, language, all that.
Gotcha. So where does trauma fit into all this?
Trauma basically hijacks the limbic system. That's like your emotional control center. Fear, anger, that fight or flight response, it all starts there.
Sounds kind of intense.
It is. When you go through trauma, there's this part of the limbic system called the amygdala. It goes haywire, like a smoke detector that won't shut up even though there's no fire.
So your brain's stuck in danger mode,
Yeah.
even when there's nothing to worry about. No wonder it's exhausting.
Exactly. And to make things worse, the brainstem gets involved too. That's the part that controls your basic stuff like breathing and heart rate. That's why trauma can mess with your body too. Your whole system's on high alert.
Okay, starting to make more sense.
So,
But how does something like neurofeedback actually fix all that? It still sounds kind of like science fiction to me.
it might sound complicated, but the idea is pretty simple. Imagine you're teaching a dog a new trick. You give them a treat when they do it right, and eventually they learn. Neurofeedback is kind of similar. But instead of a dog, you're training your brain.
Okay, I'm following you. But how do you give a brain a treat?
Neurofeedback uses sensors to track your brain waves. When your brain shows those relaxed and calm patterns, it gets rewarded, like with nice sounds or visuals.
So it's like your brain's playing a video game, and it gets points for chilling out.
You got it. And the more you do it, the more your brain starts connecting those relaxed feelings with good stuff. So it's more likely to go there even when things are tough.
That's wild.
Yeah.
It really is like teaching your brain how to heal on its own.
Exactly. You're tapping into neuroplasticity. That's your brain's superpower to change and adapt all throughout your life.
Now remember the workbook talked about two kinds of neurofeedback, ILF and alpha theta training. What was the difference again? My brain's getting a bit overloaded.
Don't worry, it's a lot to take, and ILF training targets these super slow brain waves that help control your stress response. It's like teaching your body to chill out, move out of that constant state of being freaked out and into a calmer, more balanced state.
So calming the storm inside, getting your body back to a normal resting state.
You got it. And then there's alpha theta training. That one focuses on the brain waves that go with deep relaxation and meditation. Those times when you feel super peaceful and insightful.
I remember the workbook saying, this can even help you process trauma in a whole new way. How does that work?
Imagine this. When you're in that super relaxed state, your brain can actually access those traumatic memories without getting overwhelmed by them. It's like you can look at them from a safe distance, and that makes it easier to process and understand them.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. But I also like that the workbook doesn't just focus on these high-tech solutions. It talks about ways to heal from trauma without needing any fancy gadgets, right?
Absolutely. Remember those practical steps we talked about before? Acceptance, self-responsibility, mindfulness, movement, connection. Those are all super valuable, no matter if you get professional help or have access to things like neurofeedback.
And the best part is anyone can do them. You don't need a doctor's note or a therapist to get started.
Exactly. You're in charge of your own healing, and that's huge.
Speaking of taking charge, there's a whole section on the workbook called Self-Healing. Start your recovery from trauma. Anything jump out at you from that part?
I think what's really powerful about that section is the reminder that even though professional help can be amazing, you've got so much power to help yourself heal. It's not about pretending nothing happened. It's about learning to live with what happened without letting it control you.
So like practical tips for dealing with trauma in everyday life, what kind of stuff does it recommend?
It talks about the importance of taking care of yourself, getting enough sleep, exercising regularly, eating good food, and avoiding those unhealthy ways of coping, like drugs or alcohol. They might seem basic, but they're the foundation for getting better.
Makes sense. You can't expect to heal if you're running on fumes or numbing yourself out all the time.
Right. It also says it's important to not bottle up your feelings. Keeping things inside just makes them worse. It encourages you to find healthy ways to express your emotions, whether it's talking to someone you trust, journaling, making art, being in nature, whatever feels good for you.
So it's about honoring your feelings, not trying to fight them or pretend they're not there.
Exactly. And it's about slowly getting back into your normal routine, one step at a time. It recognizes that healing isn't a straight line. You're going to have good days and bad days.
That's good to hear. I think a lot of people feel like they have to get over it quickly.
Yeah.
And that's just not realistic.
Nope. And that's where those coping skills and trigger identification things we talked about come in. By figuring out what sets off those intense reactions, you can start to manage them better and create a sense of safety and predictability in your life.
Like having a roadmap for those tough moments, instead of feeling blindsided all the time.
Exactly. And the workbook keeps reminding you about connection. Don't isolate yourself. Stay connected with your people. Nurture those relationships that bring you joy and support.
It's a reminder that you don't have to go through this alone. Having people who care can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. Something else that stuck with me from the workbook was how much it emphasized understanding how trauma affects your body. We talked about somatization before, but I think it's worth digging a little deeper.
Yeah, we touched on it, but I'm definitely curious to hear more.
The workbook goes beyond just mentioning somatization. It gives some really interesting examples of how trauma can show up physically. It can play a role in sleep problems, digestive issues, chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, even a weakened immune system.
Wow, so it really affects everything. It's not just a mental or emotional thing.
It really does. And the workbook also addresses a misconception that I think a lot of people have, that trauma have to be some big life or death event to be real trauma.
Gotta admit, I've definitely thought that way before. So what are some of those less obvious forms of trauma that people might not even realize they're dealing with?
We'll take chronic stress, for example. If you're always under a lot of stress, maybe from a crazy job, a toxic relationship, or money problems, it can actually affect your brain and body in the same way as a single traumatic event.
That's kind of scary to think about. So
Yeah.
even those normal things could be traumatic if they push you too far for too long.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to pay attention to how your body reacts to stress, those physical symptoms we talked about, the tiredness, the stomach problems, the aches and pains. Those could be your body's way of saying something's wrong.
So if you're experiencing those things, it could be a sign that there's some trauma you need to deal with, even if you don't realize it's there.
Exactly. And you know what else is really important? And the workbook stresses this too. We got to talk about the stigma around trauma.
That's so true.
Mm.
There's still so much shame and silence around this topic. It stops people from getting help or even admitting what they're going through.
Exactly. And that shame just makes you feel alone and can do a lot of damage.
Yeah.
The workbook encourages us to be open and honest about trauma, both for people who've experienced it and those who care about them.
That's where that secondary trauma thing comes in again, right?
Mhm.
Taking care of someone who's been through trauma can be really hard. And it's important for caregivers to take care of themselves too and ask for help.
Absolutely. The workbook talks about self-care for caregivers so they don't get crushed by all the emotional weight. It's a reminder that taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's crucial if you want to be there for others.
Like putting on your own oxygen mask first before helping anyone else. You can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. And all of this leads to another key idea in the workbook that gives me a lot of hope. The possibility of post-traumatic growth.
That's something I'm really drawn to. The idea that even after going through something so awful, you can actually come out stronger and more resilient, like finding a diamond in the rough.
The workbook doesn't try to make trauma sound easy, but it also gives this powerful message of hope and change. It highlights how a lot of people who go through trauma say they feel stronger, more resilient, and even more connected to others afterwards.
So it's not about pretending the trauma didn't happen. It's about finding meaning and growth in the middle of the struggle.
You got it. Yeah. And the workbook breaks down some of the specific areas where this growth can happen. One that really hit me was the idea of a change in perspective. After trauma, people often start to appreciate life more and feel grateful for things they maybe took for granted before.
It's like they've been given a second chance and they want to live it to the fullest. Like they see the world with new eyes, noticing the beauty and how fragile everything is.
Exactly. And this new perspective can change their relationships too. People who've been through trauma often say they feel more compassionate and understanding towards others because they've gone through something hard themselves. They get human suffering on a deeper level and can connect with others in a more real way.
Like they've joined this club that nobody wants to be in. But inside that club, there's this deep level of understanding and support. They've walked through fire together. And that creates a strong bond.
Absolutely. And then there's the growth that happens in terms of personal strength. After overcoming something so tough, people often find this inner strength and resilience they didn't know they had. They realize they're way stronger than they thought.
Like they've been through the fire and come out forged, stronger and tougher. They faced their demons and won. And that gives them this confidence and power that can carry them through anything.
Exactly. And this newfound strength can help them face new challenges with more courage and determination. They know they can handle whatever comes their way because they've already been through hell and back.
So trauma can actually be what makes you a better, stronger person. It's not just damage and brokenness. It's also about the possibility of growing and being resilient.
In a lot of ways, yes. And the workbook emphasizes that this growth isn't about becoming a totally different person. It's about adding those tough experiences to your story and letting them shape you in good ways.
It's about understanding that your scars, the ones you can see and the ones you can't, they're not things to be ashamed of. They're like badges of honor that tell a story of strength and survival. It's about owning your story and using it to help yourself and others.
Exactly. And this process of understanding and accepting your story can lead to a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. People who've been through trauma often find new passions and things they care about because they want to make a difference in the world. They want to use what they've been through to help others going through the same thing or to change things so others don't have to experience that pain.
So even though the workbook doesn't sugarcoat how awful trauma is, it also gives us this amazing message of hope. It shows us that even in the darkest times, there's still potential for incredible growth and change. It's a reminder that even when we suffer, the human spirit can find a way to heal and even thrive.
That's the amazing thing about humans. Our ability to be resilient and to grow is incredible. We can adapt, we can learn, we can find meaning, and we can connect, even when things are really, really tough.
And the workbook encourages us to embrace that ability, both for ourselves and for those around us who've been through trauma. It reminds us that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's also about helping what's good to grow even stronger.
Absolutely. It's about seeing that even after trauma, there's still beauty, there's still joy, there's still the possibility for love, connection, and a life full of meaning. It's about looking at what's possible, not just what's been lost.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave everyone with a question to think about. If you've experienced trauma, how has it shaped who you are? And what possibilities for growth do you see in your own journey?
That's a powerful question. And for those who haven't gone through trauma themselves, think about how you can support those who have. Let's make a world where everyone can heal and grow. A world where we acknowledge the pain of trauma, but also celebrate how strong the human spirit is.
Well said. And remember, the body keeps the score. Goes even deeper into all this. It's full of knowledge and insights for anyone wanting to understand and heal from trauma.
So if this deep dive has got you curious, I definitely recommend checking out the book. It could change how you think about trauma and healing.
And don't forget, you're not alone in this. There's help out there, and there's always hope. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.